third one I'm going to sign, and that's what I'm going to do while you're all here, is the commitment I made that we're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord as of today.
The newly inaugurated President Biden has already begun his climate work through multiple executive orders, and pressure is high to make good on his stated campaign promises, like a nearly $2 trillion federal investment proposal. With Democrats clinching victory in Georgia, he has blue control of Congress, and with it, significant power to implement his agenda in office. After running a presidential campaign with the strongest climate positions to date, President Biden is supremely positioned to kick the US into high gear when it comes to tackling climate change, something the US and the world both desperately need. But what exactly is a Biden administration likely to do in its climate-related efforts? What has it already done? And will these efforts keep up with what scientists and organizations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, say need to happen? This video is going to be an attempt to answer these questions. To start, Biden has a clear set of climate-related goals. Establish enforcement mechanisms and milestone targets in his first term by 2025, cut carbon emissions from the electricity sector by 2035, and ensure a 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050. Any assessment of Biden's likely climate actions must find its foundation in examining these claims. So let's see what specifics he may be planning that would allow or prevent these proposals to become reality, and what avenues are at his disposal to make these plans real. The most immediate execution of power at Biden's disposal is, as we've seen, the executive order. While this avenue is contentious because it is easier to be overturned by a subsequent president, as we see in the dichotomy and immediate difference between Trump and Biden's direction of America's involvement in the Paris Accord.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
We're going to get back into the Paris Agreement, back into the business of leading the world.
It is a valid way to implement quick political change that has the chance to become long-term. For example, a subsequent departure from the Paris Accords after 8 or even 4 years of a Biden administration which has been integrally working with and under the agreement will likely be a mighty challenge for any future administration, regardless of the fact that the original re-entry by Biden was via executive order.
We're going to lock in progress that no future president can roll back or undercut to take us backward again.
So we have already seen President Biden avail of this avenue on day one, with the executive order to re-enter Paris. At the same time, he signed quite a few other orders, including one other having to do with climate. This order, on protecting public health and the environment, dealt with initiatives like protecting the Arctic refuge, revising fuel standards, reevaluating the social cost of carbon, and it canceled the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, the controversial oil pipeline which would run from Canada to the United States. From these actions, we can see that climate issues ranked relatively high in Biden's priorities, considering they made up multiple of his day one orders. This also means President Biden is willing to use the power of executive order for climate-related purposes. And it's worth noting that he says as much in his climate plan. In terms of future use of this power, CNBC reports that Biden may utilize orders to, among other things, conserve 30% of America's land and waters by 2030, and further protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from drilling. While Biden has emphasized that he wants to limit his use of executive orders to what he believes is constitutionally safe,
I am not going to violate the Constitution. Executive authority that my progressive friends talk about is way beyond the bounds.
His presented willingness shows that even if he plans to use them sparingly, he is not afraid to use them, and will not shy away from making use of them when it is appropriate to do so. From an executive order standpoint, President Biden has a decently strong climate direction. But what about other executive powers afforded him? Who Biden chooses to surround himself with in his first term should be telling, to some degree, of the direction he plans to go. And some of the people filling Biden's closest seats are climate heavyweights. Former Secretary of State John Kerry as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, former EPA head Gina McCarthy as National Climate Advisor, North Carolina Environment Secretary Michael Regan as EPA head, and former Michigan governor and clean energy scholar Jennifer Granholm as Secretary of Energy, among other secretaries and appointments sympathetic to the climate fight. Filling these top roles with people experienced in climate policy and pointed towards fighting climate change, people like John Kerry, who was the nation's chief representative in forming the Paris Agreement under Obama, is a stark departure from Trump-era picks of EPA heads known for suing the EPA and energy secretaries who forget the department's name while calling for its very own abolishment. Utilizing appointments, secretaries, and agency heads is one of the main tools Biden has at his direct disposal through his executive power. Results of these choices could include officials such as Kerry helping to forge new international climate agreements which dictate more ambitious carbon reduction goals. The US taking a strong stance on the world stage would help galvanize global confidence and reinforce global commitments. Back at home, the Environmental Protection Agency is going to be one of the most powerful players in actually changing the US's own emissions and environmental policies. Some of the actions the EPA could take are pursuing criminal anti-pollution cases, bolstering the agency's number of employees to make up for Trump-era losses, eliminating agency rollbacks also based in Trump-era policy, and retightening lax regulations while building strong new ones. The last point will probably be the most significant and the most challenging. It will include working with the Department of Transportation under now Secretary Buttigieg to enact fuel economy rules, while developing its own plan to deal with emissions from stationary sources like power plants, among others. The plan the EPA decides upon in this regard will be of utmost importance because of the huge carbon impact from the energy generation sector, and in relevance to Biden's 2035 goal of a net zero electricity sector. A lot of climate and emission policy will be dictated in some form by the EPA, which, moving forward, we can expect to be in stark contrast with the agency's recent pass under Trump, though again, the precise intensity of contrast is left to be determined. Within the departments and agencies of the executive, there is broad scope and nuanced power. Biden has made some strong picks regarding climate change, but we will need to see what these agencies actually go through with in terms of policy and protocol changes. Even with some certainties, like the EPA fighting back against some of Trump's rollbacks, much will still depend on precisely how far these certainties go and on the realization of certain uncertainties. And speaking of uncertainties, the most difficult, yet most powerful and perennial avenue for political change at current disposal would be legislation passed through Congress and signed by the president. Legislation is the backbone for change in America, and has felt, to some degree, stalled in recent years by increasing gridlock. For calls of unity to be substantiated, and some amount of faith restored in our overall system of governing, and Congress in particular, real legislation needs to happen. For Biden, this would mean getting bills through a fairly blue House and a barely blue Senate. In all likelihood, for most bills, this would only be achievable with 10 Republicans crossing the aisle and voting with a unified body of Democrats, something that itself cannot be taken for granted. Whereas certain bills that traditionally get broad support, like budget and stimulus, may also be avenues for Biden to implement his agenda, namely a costly climate contrivance, more specific policy will have to be achieved, if at all, via bipartisan cooperation. While attempts at bipartisanship reaped poor results during Obama's time in office, the new political climate, where public opinions on carbon regulations continue to warm, could make Republican senators more likely to side with climate legislation, whether that comes in large standalone bills or as riders, smaller parts of larger multifaceted bills. With Biden having a history of reaching across the aisle, and some Republican senators, like Senator Lisa Murkowski, aligning with Democratic concerns about climate change, bipartisan legislation is at least a possibility. It may have a low likelihood, but Democratic control of the Senate will make sure some chance exists. And in the unfortunately likely case that bipartisanship does not prevail, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has made explicit that nothing is off the table. One of those tools on the table to use in the face of nowhere-going aisle-reaching would be a budgetary procedure called reconciliation, a tactic used under Bush and Trump for tax cuts and under Obama for part of the Affordable Care Act. Reconciliation has strong limits on what can be done through it, but its benefit is that it only requires a simple majority to pass, something the Democrats have. In our context, some possible passable policy would be wind and solar tax credits, oil and gas tax royalties, and even a tax on carbon dioxide emissions. To be clear, these are not specific policy suggestions coming from Biden's camp, but they are some possibilities of what Democrats could do. So we have seen some of what the Biden administration has done, will likely do, and can do. With that in mind, the final question remains: is it enough? Biden's goals seem to line up with the IPCC goal of net zero by 2050 to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, keeping in mind that there's even contention that previous Paris goals are not enough. But it is to be proved whether or not President Biden's initiatives, policies, and plans will firstly get implemented, and secondly, truly put us on the path to net zero by 2050. Predicting those outcomes right now, before specific policies come out from agencies like the EPA, or before Republicans vocalize their stances on Democratic climate proposals, seems like some low-light shooting. That said, a relatively strong stance has already been taken by the Biden administration, which gives reason to believe that there will be some substantive climate progress under this presidency. Though at the risk of repeating it ad nauseum, truly how much progress is left to be determined, and maximizing that progress will depend on continued pressure, activism, communication, and conversation, on all stages, local to international, about the gravity of the threat that is climate change and what we can do to combat it.
I gotta pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.